My next guest is a friend of the show, and he's given us a lot of expertise so far, all about how we can deal with different types of anxiety. He's a clinical psychologist at the Anxiety and Stress Reduction Centre of Seattle. Dr. Travis Osborne, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
So, first of all, today what we're going to talk about is PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder. What exactly is that?
Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very specific type of anxiety that develops after people have experienced some sort of traumatic event. And we use that word traumatic event a lot in our society, but when we're talking about PTSD, we're really talking about a few specific kinds of traumatic events. And what we're referring to here is kind of actual or imagined events that could cause death, really serious injury, or some kind of sexual violence. So we're really talking about those situations or experience in life that are kind of the most threatening that people can imagine. And there's a couple different ways that people can experience those events. They can experience them directly. They can witness those events happening to somebody else. They can hear about those events or learn of those events having affected a loved one, a close family member, a close friend. Or they can have experienced those as part of their job. So when we think about firefighters, police officers, first responders, people who see kind of the aftermath of trauma, those are kind of the main ways that people would typically experience those events.
So how would you know if you had PTSD?
Well, one of the things that's challenging in this area is that when anytime anyone experiences a traumatic event, it is normal to go through a period of time of considerable distress. Of anxiety, of changes in mood, of distressing thoughts about what happened. And what we know is that for most people, those symptoms will decrease over time. And as they slowly process what happened and talk about what happened, their distress will go down. PTSD is kind of a special case in which those symptoms that are so normal following a traumatic event don't decrease. Something gets in the way and perpetuates those symptoms. And so there's a whole range of symptoms that people can experience, and I want to kind of touch on those so that people who are listening can really understand the various ways that PTSD can show up. One area of symptoms that is what we call intrusive symptoms, and so these are symptoms that the person experiences where they're having intense memories, perhaps, of the event that took place that are just popping into their mind. They're not thinking about it on purpose, but the thoughts are kind of intruding. Another way that can look is people having really distressing dreams or sometimes nightmares about what happened. And in the most extreme case, people can have what we call flashbacks, which is literally feeling as if the event is happening again and that they're actually in the event. It's very hard to tell the difference between kind of reality and whether this is just a memory. People will often come into treatment if they're having flashbacks saying, like, I feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like I'm actually in the event again. It's a very powerful experience. And the other two intrusive symptoms that people can experience is just really intense emotional or physiological reactions when they're confronted with something that reminds them about the traumatic event.
So those are the symptoms. So what would that kind of lead to? I'm guessing that people might want to try and avoid being around those situations that would remind them of that particular thing.
Exactly. So when someone is having just these really intrusive memories or thoughts or dreams and lots of, emotional distress when they think about or are confronted with the trauma, the normal urge to do in that situation is to start avoiding. And so there's a second set of symptoms called avoidance symptoms. And people either do one or both of these two things. They either start pushing thoughts of the traumatic event out of their minds, or they intentionally don't talk about it with other people because it's too distressing. Or they start avoiding things in the world that remind them of the trauma. So, for example, they might not go to places where the trauma took place. Or if there are people or things that remind them of the traumatic event, they might stop going around those. A really common one is if there are movies or TV shows that depict similar kinds of things that they went through, whether it was a car accident or being assaulted in some way, they might just avoid those kinds of programs. So people can really start engaging in a lot of avoidance behaviors, and this avoidance is a big driver of why the symptoms persist over time.
And I'm guessing that if they're starting to avoid and they're having all these terrible kind of symptoms and thoughts and feelings, that will over time affect their mood, probably long term.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we can see in PTSD a number of really big changes in mood, and changes in the way that people think. And so with regard to mood, we see lots of feelings of fear, of shame, sometimes of feelings of horror about what happened. We can see people starting to feel really detached from other people, feeling disconnected from others, and having a really hard time experiencing positive emotions such as love or joy or pleasure in things. People can lose interest in activities that they normally enjoy. It can start to look somewhat like depression. And then some of the changes in thinking or cognitive functioning that people can experience is that they start to have really distorted thoughts about themselves, thoughts of self-blame, that they might have been at fault for what happened, difficulty in remembering certain parts of the event so that the memory is kind of jumbled in their minds, and kind of other exaggerated beliefs about the world or other people, so that the world is now unsafe. Or that other people are unsafe, or certain situations are unsafe. And so we see...
Kind of generalized then, has it? They kind of generalize those?
Absolutely. What we see is this overgeneralization of the threat that was present in the traumatic event, and people kind of expanding that to feel that that now encompasses kind of this much bigger threat in the world. And those thoughts and feelings can become very overwhelming.
So, and I guess also where normal reaction to situations like, for example, we're coming up to firework, bonfire night and things like that. So using that as an example, someone that's maybe experienced a trauma around loud noises of some kind, that would be enough to where we might look at it as an enjoyable experience of watching fireworks. That could make them even more sensitive.
Absolutely. And the kind of final cluster of symptoms that we see with PTSD is people their nervous systems being incredibly reactive. Because of what they've been through. And so the example that you gave, what might be sort of a normal activity of watching fireworks, and it might be very festive. If someone's nervous system is on edge, what we can see in PTSD is this really exaggerated startle response. For example, when you hear sort of loud noises, or if somebody is behind you and you don't notice them, it's a really intense startle response. We can also see things like a lot of hypervigilance. So people really kind of paying so much attention to their environment, constantly scanning the environment for any potential threats so that they can keep themselves safe. And these kinds of things lead to, difficulties concentrating and focusing, because if you're on edge all the time, it's very hard to concentrate. It can lead to problems with sleeping, because it can be hard for the person to actually relax enough to fall asleep. And can also just lead to this chronic state of feeling kind of irritated and angry, because the nervous system is really on edge. So what we get is this kind of, the individual is sort of kind of flooded with these really negative thoughts and feelings about the event. They're feeling just really heightened in terms of their physical responses, and then they just want to start avoiding. And you can see how overwhelming, those symptoms can be. And the really, the most challenging or kind of heartbreaking part about PTSD really is that all of these things are happening to someone when they've already lived through some really awful event. So they've lived through this really awful event, and now they're kind of reliving that awful event kind of over and over and over again. And it just makes for an incredibly difficult situation to cope with.
So where someone would go through some kind of normal trauma or hear about it or be involved in some way, and then that could affect them, and naturally they will have certain symptoms like you said. What are the differences? How do you know when it goes from that natural cycle of processing it and being upset and anxious to PTSD?
That's a great question. So for the purpose of a diagnosis, what we think about in the mental health field is when those symptoms that I discussed, which are pretty normal after a trauma, are lasting for more than a month after the traumatic event, and that at that point they're really interfering with functioning. So people are having a hard time, functioning optimally at school or work, or in their relationships or in their day-to-day lives because of those symptoms, and that's gone on for more than a month after the trauma. That's when we really start thinking about PTSD. And a really important point for people to understand is that the majority of people, 80 to 90% of people who actually experience the type of traumas we're discussing do not go on to develop PTSD. The majority of people who experience trauma do recover naturally over time, but about 10 to 20% of people don't, and for whatever reason get sort of stuck in that place and don't recover. And there's been a lot of interesting research to tell us about who's more vulnerable to developing PTSD, and one of the things we know is that the type of trauma that people experience can make them more vulnerable to developing PTSD. So traumas that involve other people, so sexual violence, being assaulted, being in combat, people who are prisoners of war, those kinds of things, interpersonal kinds of trauma, people are much more likely to develop PTSD as compared to, say, people who are in like a car accident or maybe some sort of natural disaster where the cause is not, or the focus of the trauma is not another human being per se. And so we know that interpersonal violence, people are, 30 to 50%, likely to develop PTSD if they experience interpersonal violence. And so we also know that people who experience repeated trauma, so multiple traumatic events, are much more likely to develop PTSD. And where we see that a lot is with cases of child abuse or things that maybe went on over long periods of time, or people who have been in a war zone and have been in combat for long periods of time. Those people are at much higher risk for developing those problems.
So are there specific things that people that have maybe recently gone through some kind of trauma or they're identifying recently with some of the symptoms that you've talked about, so within the last couple of 3 to 4 weeks, that they could be doing to try and ensure that they don't go on and develop PTSD? Are there things that they could do?
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking earlier about avoidance and avoiding talking about or thinking about the traumatic event. And it turns out this is probably one of the really key pieces of information that determines when people sort of move forward and recover naturally and when they don't. So if you think about the normal thing that we all do when we experience a stressful event is we start telling people about it. Even if we have just a very simple stressful event, like somebody cut me off in traffic, or you wouldn't believe what somebody said at the grocery store today, or somebody was so rude to me. What we tend to do is we tell the story, and we tell it a number of times, and after we've told it, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, our emotion about it tends to kind of come down. We've kind of processed the event, and we kind of move forward. The natural thing to do after a trauma is also to talk about it, is to tell the story and talk about it and think about what happened. And that act of talking about it and thinking about it helps our emotion come down, and it also helps us understand and process what happens. One thing that people can do is, as they feel ready, is to intentionally seek support and actually talk about what occurred. Even the act of talking about it with one other person can facilitate that normal recovery. And also when the thoughts come in and they're uncomfortable, working on just allowing those thoughts to be there and allowing the story to play out in one's mind helps you get used to it and not be so fearful of it. And so that is one just very basic strategy that people can do that can make a huge difference.
So being more accepting of their emotions and their thoughts at that time and just allowing them to happen, whereas we don't want to do that. We want to push them away.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's important that people not take that message as, well, I didn't talk about the trauma and so it's my fault that I developed PTSD. There's lots of good reasons why people sometimes don't talk about traumatic events. Sometimes they're just very embarrassing or shameful to talk about it. It's difficult to discuss. Sometimes people don't have people in their lives that they feel that they can entrust that information to, or maybe they're in environments that are really punishing of talking about feelings or difficult circumstances. And so there's lots of reasons why somebody might not end up seeking support or talking about it. But regardless of what the cause is, it can have a really significant impact.
So, are there specific things that people would do? We've talked about kind of avoidance behaviors. Are there other things that people do when they have gone on to develop PTSD that kind of keep it in their life?
Yeah. So as with lots of the other anxiety disorders we've talked about on your show, people who've experienced trauma can develop a lot of safety behaviors that are designed to keep themselves safer in the future as a way of making themselves feel like they could prevent the bad thing from happening again. So that can look a whole lot of ways, but common ones would be if somebody was, let's say, assaulted in some capacity, they're physically assaulted or sexually assaulted, they might start not carrying certain things with them, like making sure they always have a cell phone with them so they can call for help. They might carry pepper spray with them, or some other means that they could kind of protect themselves if they needed to. They might kind of avoid going places at certain times of day, like maybe not going out in the evenings, or only going out in the evening if somebody is with them. So they kind of start organizing their lives in these ways to try to make themselves feel safer. And those safety behaviors, although they can make the person feel temporarily safe, kind of also create this feedback loop to the brain that the world is a really dangerous place. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to be going to all of these great lengths to keep yourself so safe. And that, unfortunately, can then keep that fear about the situation alive over time and kind of backfire on the person as time goes by.
And that was an interesting point that you just made there. So from the actual physical thing to the experiencing of it, to the feelings and the scary thoughts, to the behaviours, that then could change what they believe. So they could go out one morning, maybe get attacked. Before they're attacked, they think the world's a relatively simple place. And then that one incident happens and they generalise it to say, well, do you know what? Nowhere is safe in the world anymore. And then they become more and more just in their house. So what can you do if you're feeling like you've maybe taken on these beliefs that aren't helping you?
Yeah, you really kind of identified a key component of PTSD, which is when people experience these kind of events, it tends to change the way they think about the world, and it tends to change the way they think about themselves. And those changes are normal, and when they're temporary and then go back to usual, that's when people recover. So if someone used to think the world was a safe place, went through a traumatic event, went through a period of time where the world felt more dangerous, but then they kind of went back over time to seeing the world as a safe place, that's the person who's not going to be very likely to develop PTSD. If somebody gets stuck in that place of the world is now unsafe, and that doesn't go back to kind of normal or back to baseline, that person is now at high risk for developing PTSD. And so common beliefs that we see are beliefs about safety, because a lot of trauma involves physical risk, to oneself, so that other people are unsafe or certain types of people. So if a woman is sexually assaulted by a male, men sort of as a global category become unsafe. People who have been in certain war zones, who have been fighting certain ethnic groups, everyone in that ethnic group becomes, unsafe or suspect. Or it's just certain environments. If someone was in a car accident, cars become unsafe or forms of transportation become unsafe. So we see these overgeneralizations to whole categories of people or places. And then another really big one is people blaming themselves for what occurred. This is a really normal response to bad things happening. And part of the reason for that is most of us have what we call in the mental health field the just world belief, which is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And that's just a very common belief that people have, whether they're kind of aware of it or not. And so if something really bad happens to you and you have that belief, one risk is that you leave the situation then thinking, well, if something bad happened to me, I must be a bad person, or there must be something that I did or that I contributed to this situation in some way. And that belief about self-blame can be so damaging when it comes to recovering from a trauma, because it points people looking in the wrong direction for the source of the problem, and makes them feel very kind of defective and at cause for what happened. So if people are experiencing these kinds of beliefs, again, one of the key things to do is to really kind of compare them to what are the beliefs that you had before this traumatic event happened, and how did this trauma change the way that you're thinking, and to really look at, are you making any overgeneralizations about the whole state of the world or a whole category of people based on what occurred. And if that's true, to really work to shift that thinking back to what it looked like before the traumatic event. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is by decreasing avoidance behaviors, by resuming your normal routines and seeing, is the world really as dangerous as it feels?
So that's quite nice, leading on to how best to deal with it if you have got PTSD, and one of those would be to decrease avoidance behaviours. What other things can people do themselves to help them move forward and get through it, get past it?
A huge one is seeking support. And we haven't talked about this so much with the other types of anxiety that we've discussed, but seeking emotional and social support after a trauma is really critical. And again, this is for multiple reasons. One, people who have been traumatized can get very isolated and feel very alone. And even being able to discuss what happened with one other individual can make a giant difference. But if there's multiple people that people can seek help from, that's even better. So reaching out to people is a really critical part of the process. Also, because of the reactivity in people's nervous systems that take place following a trauma, people can be so on edge that relaxation skills can be really helpful. They don't solve the problem of PTSD, meaning they don't help the person process the events of what happened, but they can help kind of dampen down these nervous system responses. So, diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, meditation, yoga, whatever things actually help kind of calm the body can actually have a positive effect on the nervous system. And then just really examining these beliefs in detail, and really looking at one's own thinking and seeing the ways that it's gotten off track, and working on looking for the evidence if those beliefs are really true is a really, really critical part of the process.
And so really the message is the sooner that you can do something towards it, about it, the better. And it doesn't matter how long you've waited, it's never too late.
Yeah. And another thing is that, if support isn't available, I've said how talking about the story, telling the story of the trauma is so important. If that isn't available, another really effective tool that people have found is to actually write out what happened. Write out the story. Even if you don't have somebody that you feel comfortable you can tell it to. But the act of writing it out in detail and then reading it multiple times or writing it out multiple times is another good way for people to process the events if they're not yet ready to talk to another person. When we do therapy for PTSD, a huge part of the treatment is having people tell the story and to tell it again and again and again and again until they reach the point that they can tell it in a way that feels somewhat comfortable. And we often start by having them write it, and then read it and then actually say it out loud, because it's often too difficult for people to say it out loud at first. So that kind of written exposure of the memory can be a really useful tool.
And so how long would it take? I mean, I know this is probably a difficult question to answer, but if someone were to kind of follow this information, how long would it take them to see a difference, to feel a difference?
Yeah, PTSD is one of those areas that as a field we actually have made huge progress, and I would say it's actually one of the more treatable of the anxiety disorders that we've talked about. We can often see huge gains if we're doing actually therapy for PTSD, which includes all the things that I talked about. In anywhere from 10 to 12 sessions, we can see enormous gains. And part of the reason for this, and part of the reason why it can go faster than a lot of the other anxiety disorders that we talked about, is the majority of people with PTSD were actually functioning pretty well before the trauma happened. This very specific event happened, and then they developed these symptoms related to this event. And so we can make a lot of change quickly because we're usually just trying to get people back to where they were, before this event kind of interrupted their lives. If people are doing this at home and they're really working hard to kind of face the memory, push themselves to decrease avoidance behaviors, tell the story or write about the story, you can definitely start to see changes, over a period of, just a few months. People can see dramatic changes. It's those changes in avoidance of thinking about it and talking about it that make a huge difference. So it's very treatable, and it's very treatable in a relatively short-term way.
And I suppose it's back to, with most of the, if not all of the anxiety disorders that we've talked about, it's persistence, is sticking with the treatment, whether you're doing it yourself or with someone, going to the places that you avoid over and over again. I think you said that in the very first interview, that It's not just doing the thing once, it's doing it many times.
That's a great point, and that holds true too for telling the story. So people also need to understand that telling the story one or two times probably isn't going to be enough to move past it. It's telling the story again and again and again. Someone might tell the story to me in our therapy 20 or 30 or 40 times to get the desired result, or they might have to write it 10, 15, 20 times to get that result. And so it's really that repetition of facing that thing which feels so frightening. But what I always tell my clients who have PTSD is that they actually already lived through the most difficult part. They actually already survived the part that was the most dangerous and the most difficult. And now what we're up against is fighting the memory. And although the memory is intensely scary and brings up lots of feelings, the memory itself is not dangerous, and that they've already lived through the dangerous part. And that can be a very helpful thing for people to hang on to as they do this work, because it is very frightening, and it's probably one of the most frightening of the anxiety disorders that we've talked about, because unlike the other disorders where we talked about, the worst case thing has actually happened. In all the other types of anxiety we've discussed, typically people are worried about the worst case thing happening, but in many cases that hasn't actually necessarily occurred. In the case of PTSD, someone's worst case situation or worst case fear has occurred. And it's important to see that distinction, and people need to understand that they were strong enough to survive the actual event. They are definitely strong enough to survive the memory of that event.
Fantastic. And a good resource to tell people about is, I think you said it's the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies.
That's correct.
And that's at www.istss.org.
That's right.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Travis Osborne, thank you very much.
Thank you.